January 17, 1943. The frozen plains outside Belgorod stretch endlessly under a gray, oppressive sky. Snow crunches beneath the tracks of T-34 tanks, each shuddering over frozen earth. A bitter wind cuts through the soldiers' woolen coats, carrying the distant rumble of artillery. On a slight rise, a Soviet gunner crouches behind the barrel of his T-34's 76.2mm gun. His breath fogs in the air, and his eyes narrow through the crude optics, scanning the horizon. Across a mile of white wasteland, a German Panzer IV emerges from a drifted tree line, its turret slowly rotating. The gunner knows the odds: 1,800 yards, a moving target, freezing conditions, and the slightest miscalculation could mean death. Yet in the back of his mind, he recalls his commander's precise training, the method of altitude compensation for such impossible shots. Every calculation matters. One shot, one chance. The gunner exhales. His finger hovers over the trigger. The moment hangs suspended, ready to decide life or death. By the winter of 1942, the Eastern Front had become a frozen crucible of attrition, where millions of men, tanks, and artillery clashed across vast, open plains. The German Wehrmacht, after its rapid advance into the Soviet Union, had been slowed by the harsh Russian winter and determined Soviet resistance. Cities like Stalingrad had become symbols of endurance, while smaller towns and forests turned into deadly arenas of mechanized warfare. The front lines stretched for hundreds of miles, with armored units often advancing or retreating under brutal weather conditions that tested both man and machine. Tank warfare had evolved rapidly since the early years of the war. The Panzer divisions, spearheading the German Blitzkrieg, relied on speed, coordination, and concentrated firepower. Their Panzers, Panzer III and IV models, combined mobility with armor and powerful 75mm guns. Against these, Soviet forces had begun fielding the T-34, a revolutionary medium tank with sloped armor that could deflect many standard German rounds. The T-34's 76.2mm gun was effective, but long-range accuracy remained a challenge, especially in the rolling, snow-covered plains of southern Russia. The fight for control of terrain often hinged on the ability to engage enemy armor at distance. Every hill, ridge, and frozen riverbank became a potential observation post or firing position. Soviet gunners were trained to calculate trajectory, adjust for wind and temperature, and account for the rise and fall of the terrain, a process intensified when firing across vast open areas where the enemy could spot and counterattack. By 1943, gunnery officers had begun teaching methods of altitude compensation, a system of adjusting the gun's elevation not only for distance but also for subtle shifts in terrain and air density. In theory, it allowed a skilled gunner to reach targets nearly twice as far as a conventional estimate. The stakes were enormous. German Panzers, often manned by experienced crews, were lethal even at mid-range. Their commanders, visible in open hatches to observe the battlefield, were critical nodes. Taking them out could disrupt the cohesion of an armored column. Yet, long-range shots were considered nearly impossible. Snow reflected sunlight into scopes, freezing winds could shift the gun slightly, and the smallest miscalculation could send a shell harmlessly past a target. Despite this, Soviet commanders recognized that precision, patience, and understanding the physics of the battlefield could tip the balance. By mid-January, the Belgorod sector had become a proving ground for these new methods. German and Soviet armored units clashed repeatedly over ridges and river crossings, each side seeking the advantage in sight lines, mobility, and firing positions. Snowbanks concealed machine gun nests and anti-tank obstacles, while frozen gullies funneled armor into predictable paths. In this environment, a single well-placed shot could determine the outcome of an engagement, shatter morale, or create an opportunity to encircle the enemy. Commanders understood that beyond numbers and firepower, the individual skill of a gunner could change the dynamics of a battle. Soviet tank crews, though often young and inexperienced, were trained rigorously in calculations, teamwork, and improvisation. They studied the terrain, learned to estimate distances using rudimentary tools, and practiced under simulated combat conditions. Engineers provided ballistic tables and recommended adjustments for air pressure and temperature. The method of altitude compensation emerged from this meticulous study, a synthesis of mathematics, observation, and battlefield experience. Gunners who mastered it could hit targets previously considered out of reach. For the men crouched in frozen T-34s, the combination of human skill and mechanical reliability was everything. A successful long-range shot required timing, discipline, and nerves of steel. Beyond the physics and tactics, it demanded the mental focus to remain calm while enemy panzers maneuvered in the distance. Artillery shells burst around and frostbite numbed fingers. In the deadly ballet of the Eastern Front, those who could combine training with instinct could turn the tide, sometimes with a single, decisive shot. This careful preparation set the stage for a rare, extraordinary event. One gunner, applying every principle of altitude compensation, would attempt a shot that, if successful, would strike at the heart of the German armored force. The battlefield waited, silent except for the wind and distant rumble, as human skill met steel and snow. The specific gunner in question was part of the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Brigade, a unit hardened by months of continuous combat along the Belgorod-Kharkov sector. His T-34, battered but meticulously maintained, had survived multiple engagements. Crews often referred to their tanks as extensions of themselves. Each lever, each sight, each rumble of the engine, a familiar rhythm honed by countless hours of training and frontline experience. This particular crew had learned to anticipate enemy movements, to read the terrain like a map of potential death zones, and to adapt rapidly to any situation. The technique of altitude compensation, though rooted in physics, required intimate knowledge of one's environment. Snowdrift patterns, air density, and even temperature variations could alter a shell's flight over 1,000 yards. The gunner would need to account for the curvature of the Earth, a factor often overlooked in shorter-range engagements but critical when striking a moving panzer across nearly a mile of frozen landscape. Every calculation demanded precision. A slight misjudgment of elevation or wind could reduce a potentially deadly shot to wasted ordnance. Terrain played a critical role. The T-34's position was on a modest rise, giving the crew a vantage point over a series of depressions and ridges that the German column had to traverse. These subtle variations in elevation were crucial to the shot. Soviet instructors emphasized observation. The gunner would mark visual cues: the crest of a ridge, the shadow of a tree, the slope of a frozen ditch, and incorporate them into his targeting. The Germans, confident in the armor and firepower of their Panzer IVs, often relied on speed and maneuver to avoid long-range engagements. Yet, in open fields like these, the line between concealment and exposure was razor-thin. The gunner's optics had been calibrated meticulously. Soviet engineers had improved the T-34's periscopes and gun sights, incorporating ballistic scales and adjustments for both range and elevation. Crews were trained to estimate target distance using visual markers and to adjust their gun's elevation and traverse accordingly. By the winter of 1943, these systems were more refined than many German counterparts, though they still demanded extraordinary skill to exploit fully. The gunner's hand rested lightly on the elevation lever, eyes scanning the distant turret silhouette. Years of repetition had trained him to anticipate the subtle sway of his own tank, the deflection needed for moving targets, and the time it would take for the shell to reach its mark. Enemy movements were critical to consider. German panzers rarely traveled alone. Commanders often exposed themselves in open hatches to direct their crews and observe battlefield changes. The vulnerability was small but significant. In theory, a shot that penetrated a commander's hatch could disrupt an entire column, slowing advance or triggering withdrawal. For the Soviet gunner, this meant that every factor, range, trajectory, wind, air density, tank motion, had to be calculated with extraordinary precision. One misstep, and the opportunity would vanish. The gunner also carried the weight of human consequence. Behind him, his comrades depended on his accuracy. Forward infantry units were counting on the suppression of enemy armor to advance safely. Artillery units might adjust fire based on the results of his engagement. Even at 1,800 yards, the decision to fire carried psychological weight. One shot would kill, wound, or intimidate, leaving a ripple through both sides of the battlefield. Finally, the timing had to be perfect. German panzers were moving slowly through the snow, adjusting to terrain, scanning for hidden threats. The gunner waited for the moment when the tank's movement, the slope of the hill, and the calculated trajectory aligned. It was a delicate dance between physics and instinct, one that few gunners could master. Months of training, repeated drills, and countless smaller engagements led to this single opportunity, a fleeting chance to demonstrate the lethal potential of altitude compensation. By the time the German Panzer crested the ridge, the gunner was ready. His tank, crew, and calculations were synchronized. The artillery of winter, The frozen winds, drifting snow, and biting cold all became part of the equation. This precise alignment of factors, human skill and mechanical reliability, created the conditions for what would soon become a legendary shot on the Eastern Front. The stage was set. The gunner had done everything within his power to prepare. Now, it was time to execute. From the human perspective, the gunner's focus was absolute. In the freezing January air, every muscle tensed, every breath measured, his hands wrapped in thick gloves, barely felt the cold as they adjusted the gun's elevation and traverse. Years of drilling had prepared him for this moment, the ability to filter chaos, to see only what mattered. The distant Panzer, moving with mechanical precision, became a singular point in the snow-covered landscape. Around him, artillery shells from both sides exploded in muted thuds through the frost-laden air, yet his mind remained locked on the target. Fear existed, but it was structured, disciplined, transformed into concentration. He was not just a man behind a gun, he was the sum of his training, his crew, and the T-34 itself. Tactically, the engagement reflected the evolving nature of Eastern Front warfare. Tank battles were rarely straightforward. Commanders relied on terrain to gain advantage. The slight rise where the T-34 sat provided a line of sight over an approaching German column, but it also exposed the gunner to counterfire. Every decision was a balance between risk and opportunity. The German Panzer's movement across open ground created a predictable trajectory, yet the snow, drifting winds, and uneven earth could deflect even the most carefully calculated shot. Altitude compensation allowed the Soviet gunner to incorporate these variables into a single firing solution. In essence, he was engaging not just the tank but the battlefield itself, translating terrain, physics, and enemy behavior into a lethal equation. The interplay between human skill and tactical positioning illustrates why long-range shots were rare and revered. A gunner needed calm under pressure, precise judgment, and an understanding of how terrain shaped combat. One miscalculation could waste ammunition, alert the enemy, or result in death. But when executed correctly, a single shot could neutralize a high-value target, influence morale, and shift the local battle. On the Eastern Front, where survival depended on a combination of instinct and science, this convergence defined the difference between ordinary combat and extraordinary acts of precision. The human and tactical angles converge here: courage and calculation, fear and opportunity, man and environment. The gunner's next decision would define the moment. From a technological perspective, the T-34 was both a marvel and a challenge. Its 76.2mm gun had a reputation for reliability and destructive power, but accuracy over extreme distances demanded mastery. Soviet engineers had upgraded gun sights and periscopes, incorporating ballistic scales that allowed for fine adjustments. Air pressure, temperature, and even the subtle curvature of the terrain could be accounted for if the gunner knew how to use the instruments correctly. The concept of altitude compensation, while seemingly abstract, was a practical application of physics, adjusting elevation to account for both distance and topography. In capable hands, it transformed the T-34 from a medium-range threat into a long-distance predator capable of hitting targets that would otherwise appear untouchable. The enemy angle highlighted the Panzer commander's vulnerability. German tank crews were trained to advance with confidence, relying on armor and coordinated maneuvers. The commander's hatch, often left open to observe the battlefield, was a small but critical weakness. His elevated position allowed for better visibility, but it also made him a visible target to any alert gunner with range-finding skill. On the Eastern Front, this exposure was compounded by open terrain and snow-laden fields, which offered little concealment. The gunner's ability to identify and exploit this weak point was a testament to both observation and intuition. Leadership also played a subtle role. The Soviet crew functioned as a cohesive unit, each member aware of responsibilities: loader, driver, commander, and gunner. Orders were clear, and communication was concise. Training had emphasized that even minor delays in adjustment or miscommunication could ruin a long-range shot. The commander's trust in the gunner's skill was implicit, and the gunner's confidence, in turn, depended on the crew's efficiency. Together, these technological and enemy considerations illustrate the precision and complexity behind a single long-range shot. Success demanded intimate knowledge of the weapon, the target, and the battlefield, as well as the courage to execute under extreme pressure. One precise combination of skill, calculation, and observation could make the impossible achievable. The German Panzer IV crested the ridge, its turret scanning the frozen expanse. For a moment, it seemed almost static, a silhouette against the gray sky. The Soviet gunner tightened his grip, recalculating the trajectory, adjusting for the subtle drop of the terrain ahead, and factoring in the cold, dense air that could slow the shell's flight. His eyes locked on the commander's hatch, the small exposed square at the turret's top. Every second stretched, each heartbeat a drum of tension. The gunner's crew moved silently, synchronized by months of repetition. The loader prepared the 76.2 mm shell, counting the grams of powder, the weight of the projectile, the subtle imperfection that could mean a miss. The commander gave a terse nod, a signal of trust. In that frozen battlefield silence, artillery bursts faded into a distant rumble, and all that remained was the gunner, the barrel, and the target 1,800 yards away. He recalled the calculations etched into memory, the angle of elevation, adjusted for terrain slope, the deflection for lateral movement, the correction for wind and air density. Altitude compensation wasn't theory here. It was survival. One misjudgment and the German tank would continue its advance, the Panzer commander alive, and the chance lost. A fraction of a second passed. The gunner exhaled, allowing focus to sharpen. He steadied the barrel, aligned the crosshairs, and pressed the trigger. The recoil jerked the T-34 slightly, a reminder of the power unleashed. The shell emerged, a dark bee lure against the snowy horizon, tracing a deadly arc toward the exposed hatch. Time seemed to slow as the projectile flew over ridges and frozen gullies. Every member of the crew held their breath. Distance and chance were measured in meters, milliseconds, and human resolve. This was more than gunnery. It was precision, patience, and courage converging in a single instant. The shell approached the target. A fraction more, and history would record a moment few believed possible. The shell struck. It pierced the snow-laden air with a thunderous crack and found the commander's hatch of the Panzer IV. Armor splintered, metal twisted, and a plume of smoke and debris erupted from the turret. Inside, chaos reigned. The Panzer commander was killed instantly, and the crew scrambled in disarray, many thrown off balance by the concussive force. The Soviet gunner and his crew watched, tension still gripping them, as the result of their calculations manifested in devastating precision. The shot had traveled 1,800 yards and over a mile of frozen terrain, yet struck the most vulnerable point on the enemy tank. Other German tanks nearby hesitated, some retreating, others attempting to maneuver under fire. For a fleeting moment, the psychological impact matched the physical, a single, precise act disrupting an entire column's cohesion. Observers on both sides registered the consequences. Soviet infantry nearby advanced cautiously, emboldened by the sudden neutralization of the Panzer commander. German units, usually disciplined and coordinated, now faced hesitation. In this frozen battlefield, a single shot had shifted momentum. The snow reflected the sun into the T-34's optics as the gunner reloaded quickly, scanning for further threats. Every second mattered. The engagement was not over. This moment highlighted the deadly efficiency of altitude compensation. Precision, patience, and physics had converged. Human skill had harnessed technology and terrain to produce an effect that was both tactical and symbolic. Across the battlefield, the importance of a trained gunner, familiar with calculations and environmental variables, became evident. In that instant, the T-34 crew realized what their training had prepared them for. The impossible shot had been made, and its impact was immediate, both physically and morally. The German advance slowed, the battlefield's rhythm changed, and a new respect and fear for long-range gunnery had been etched into the minds of all who witnessed it. The stage was now set for the consequences that would ripple through the engagement, altering morale, tactics, and the flow of the battle itself. The immediate aftermath of the shot was tangible. The destruction of the Panzer commander's hatch created a ripple through the German unit. Confusion and hesitation replaced coordinated movement. Tanks that had been advancing methodically now paused, uncertain of where the next threat would emerge. Soviet infantry, previously pinned down by armor and machine gun fire, seized the opportunity to advance behind protective ridges. The T-34 crew, though still alert to enemy return fire, experienced a rare moment of vindication. Their calculations, patience, and precision had produced a decisive effect. Reports from the battlefield described the engagement in clinical terms. The Panzer IV was rendered combat ineffective. Its commander had been killed, and the remaining crew struggled to regain control under fire. Other German vehicles in the immediate vicinity slowed or altered their course to avoid the T-34's line of sight. Observers noted the psychological shock that such a precise long-range shot induced. Morale, often as critical as firepower, shifted sharply in favor of the Soviets. Soldiers who had faced armored advances with dread now understood that a single skilled gunner could neutralize a high-value target even at extreme distances. The Soviet crew's actions were not celebrated immediately. Survival and continued engagement were priorities. Yet word of the successful shot spread quickly among nearby units. Officers referenced it as an example of the effectiveness of rigorous training, accurate calculations, and disciplined teamwork. Crews across the front began to emphasize altitude compensation drills, understanding that mastery over terrain, wind, and elevation could replicate this success. From a tactical perspective, the engagement underscored the evolving nature of Eastern Front combat. Armor supremacy no longer guaranteed safety. Even heavily armored panzers were vulnerable when exposed in open terrain, particularly to gunners who understood the physics of long-range artillery. The shot did not end the battle, but it created a strategic window, one that allowed Soviet forces to advance, reposition, and exert pressure on German units in ways that previously seemed improbable. This single moment of precision would influence not just the immediate engagement, but also the training and tactics of Soviet armored units for months to come. The battlefield had been irrevocably altered by the convergence of skill, technology, and human calculation. In the days following the engagement, reports from the Belgorod sector confirmed the effectiveness of the long-range shot. German units noted the loss of their panzer commander and the disruption of the column in dispatches and field logs. Soviet commanders reviewing after-action reports highlighted the event as a remarkable demonstration of precision gunnery. The incident became a teaching point in training manuals and briefings, emphasizing the importance of altitude compensation and careful observation of enemy positions. The story spread quickly through Soviet armored formations. Crews who had witnessed the shot described it in hushed tones, marveling at the distance and accuracy achieved. The gunner's ability to neutralize a high-ranking target from 1,800 yards was extraordinary, a tangible example of how discipline, skill, and methodical calculation could overcome even the most formidable armored opponents. Commanders encouraged other gunners to replicate these techniques, adapting their training schedules to include advanced long-range targeting drills. For the Germans, the psychological impact lingered. The loss of a commander and the sudden vulnerability of panzer crews introduced a heightened caution in open terrain. Movements became more conservative, hatches were closed more frequently, and armored formations relied more heavily on infantry support to mitigate the risk of long-range engagement. The balance of risk shifted slightly, showing that even heavily armored tanks were not invulnerable when facing skilled gunners. Later, post-war analyses documented the shot as one of the more extraordinary examples of armored combat precision on the Eastern Front. Military historians highlighted it not only for the technical skill involved, but also for its broader implications. Human calculation, understanding of terrain, and methodical preparation could outweigh raw firepower. The shot became a reference point in discussions of tank warfare, emphasizing that training and ingenuity often determined outcomes in moments of extreme pressure. The battlefield itself remained scarred by snow, shell craters, and frozen tracks, a silent testament to the impact of one perfectly executed shot. Its legacy endured not just in reports and manuals, but in the recognition that mastery of the environment, physics, and human skill could create extraordinary results in the chaos of war. The shot that penetrated the Panzer commander's hatch at 1,800 yards was more than a singular act of battlefield precision. It was a convergence of human skill, mechanical innovation, and the unforgiving physics of war. On the frozen plains of Belgorod, the T-34 gunner exemplified what months of rigorous training and relentless practice could achieve. Every calculation, every observation of terrain and air pressure, every second of patient focus culminated in a moment where the improbable became reality. War is often measured in numbers. Tanks destroyed, soldiers lost, kilometers gained. Yet moments like this remind us that individual mastery can redefine the stakes. One disciplined gunner, guided by mathematics and instinct, disrupted a German armored advance, influenced the morale of both sides, and left a lasting impression on military doctrine. Precision, patience, and calm under pressure proved as lethal as firepower itself. The Eastern Front demanded adaptability. Snow, ice, and wide-open terrain tested human endurance and technological limits alike. Success often required seeing beyond immediate threats, understanding how the smallest variables could tip the balance, and trusting skill over brute force. This shot demonstrated that even in the chaos of mechanized warfare, the human mind, capable of calculation, anticipation, and courage, remained decisive. Decades later, historians and veterans alike reflect on the moment with awe. It stands not only as a testament to the T-34 and Soviet gunnery methods, but also as a symbol of the meticulous preparation, observation, and resolve that underpinned survival and victory on the Eastern Front. In the end, it was a reminder that in war, as in life, extraordinary outcomes often emerge from the patient mastery of ordinary elements, aligned with unyielding focus and courage.